this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
By the autumn of 1944, the Allies had pushed across France and Belgium, and they were standing at Germany's doorstep. Ahead of them lay the Rhine, a vast natural barrier and, for the Germans, the last line of defence protecting the heart of the Reich. What followed over the next few months was some of the most intense and costly fighting of the war in Western Europe, from the bitter battles around Aachen and the Hürtgen Forest through the crossing operations of Plunder and Varsity, and the dramatic seizure of the bridge at Remagen. The campaign for the Rhineland was brutal, chaotic, and often overshadowed by the better-known Battle of the Bulge. Yet it was here, on both sides of the Rhine, that the final collapse of Nazi Germany truly began. To help tell that story, I'm joined by military historian Anthony Tucker-Jones, author of the book Rhineland, which charts the campaign for the German border battles of late 1944 through to the end of the war in 1945. Anthony, thanks for joining me once more. Let's start with the Rhineland. What do we mean by the Rhineland in context of the Second World War? It not really occurred to me that there's a sort of significance, a physicality to the Rhineland which moves beyond those direct war years.
I mean, effectively, the Rhine forms Germany's western boundary, but of course, Germany has territory to the west of the river. But yeah, you're right. You're pointing out the Rhineland. The Rhineland's quite key because the point I make in the book is actually pretty much the Rhineland is where the Second World War started and where it finished. Now, our narrative, obviously, is Poland kicked it off. But in reality, the Rhineland in 1936 was still demilitarized as a result of the Versailles Treaty. And Germany during the 20s had the Ruhr area and the Saar back, both industrial regions, have been given back to Germany full control because as part of the reparations, those regions have been occupied by the Allies. Germany had to pay for the damage it done. So the Allies controlled the Ruhr, the Rhineland and the Saar. But by the 1930s, the Rhineland was the only bit that remained demilitarized. Britain had actually pulled out of the Rhineland, which had been occupied by occupation forces. But the key factor on the treaty was it remained demilitarized. So by which time, of course, Hitler's in power, he was not allowed to have military forces west of the Rhine River in the Rhineland. And come 36, he's come to power on that whole thing about him bringing the German Volk, the German people, back under the control of Germany and all that means. So for him, one of those key issues is, of course, reclamation of the Rhineland by asserting full military control over that. And one of the reasons he does it, of course, is if he moves military forces west of the Rhine into the Rhineland, it means he can extend his air defences west, which will mean certainly France and to a lesser extent Britain are not a threat. Their air forces are not a threat to the Ruhr. Obviously, you've got to fly over the Rhineland to get to the Ruhr, and you'd have to fly over the air defences there. So he's got sound strategic reason. It's not just an act of national politics, if you like, that the Germans will love him if he reasserts control of the Rhineland and gives the royal two fingers to Britain and America and France. He's got a sound strategic reason to do it because it will help protect Western Germany and in particular the Ruhr from air attack should war ever break out in the West. And what he does is he did it in a sort of half-hearted manner in that the troops marched over the bridges on the Rhine into the Rhineland, so onto the west bank of the Rhine, with orders that if France or Britain showed the slightest signs of resisting this, they were to withdraw. Because Hitler was not ready for a war with Western powers at that point, and also wasn't sure how Britain and France would react. Now, obviously, we know the benefit of hindsight. They did absolutely nothing. In fact, a British newspaper at the time reported something like, "Well, he's just moving back into his own back garden, isn't he? It's not a big deal." But for my mind, the crucial fact in 1936, of course, is Hitler marched his troops in there. He flew the Luftwaffe over it, did a show of power, but behind the scenes was ready to evacuate as soon as the French or British showed any signs of military activity. But Britain and France at that point, again, they were not prepared to go to war with Germany over the Rhineland. So they did nothing. And of course, that signaled to Germany that maybe this sort of nibbling tactic, which of course, as we know, he used during the 1930s, would work. So, when he starts looking at the Sudetenland and other German territories, he starts to take them slowly. The Austrians vote for unification. So that's not a provocation because it's a political act. Sudetenland Germans, they welcome German troops into Sudetenland because they're ethnic Germans, even though they're inside Czechoslovakia. He then orchestrates a crisis in Czechoslovakia, which splits the Slovaks from the Czechs, because they have that traditional hatred of each other anyway. And of course, Slovakia then asks Hitler for protection. So, as we know, there's this sort of steady expansion of German military power where the Allies do nothing. As we know, it's only when it gets to Poland that it reaches that tipping point. But I say, to my mind, 1936 is very significant because really that's where the Second World War starts. Because if Britain and France had stood up to him and said, you've got 24 hours to pull those troops out, because he didn't actually send that many in. I can't remember what the figures is, something like 30,000, over a fairly large area. If Britain and France had given him an ultimatum and said, you are to leave, Hitler would then have had to make a decision whether or not he would fight. And of course, by 1936, the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, they're not quite there yet in terms of being ready to wage war. It's notable that Hitler didn't send any of his panzers over the river, because he was worried that he would lose them. So actually it was only infantry that marched over the bridges with bands and women and children waving flags and throwing flowers at them. So again, they welcomed into Rhineland because it's a German area. It's that fact that I think Hitler took notice and went, they did nothing. It's this where the Second World War really kicks off. And then obviously on the Western Front, it's pretty much where the war ends because it's the Allies exerting pressure to get to the river itself to strike into the very heart of central Germany. Once they do that. And obviously for the Allies on the Western Front, as we can discuss more in a bit, is the Ruhr is the key because that's the heart of German industrial military might. That's where the bulk of its weapons and its coal and its steel is coming from. And despite the best efforts of the strategic bomber campaign, under Speer, German armaments factories are not really showing any signs of slackening off production. In fact, the key problems that the Germans have, it's not so much the bombing campaign, it's the disruption to the railways, which obviously the bombers are doing, so they can't move finished equipment. But also, crucially, Speer knows that they're running out of raw resources. Because obviously, as the Third Reich and its empire began to contract, they've got less and less access to oil, to nickel, to iron ore, all those sorts of things, coal, that they need to produce weapons. So actually, the crucial point, certainly by late 44 and early 45, is Speer knows that they're running out of raw materials, which in a way makes the defence of the West Bank pointless because the Ruhr is going to grind to a halt at some point anyway. But again, we can discuss German strategy a bit more.
There's a symbolism to this Rhineland as well, though, because obviously the French have the Maginot Line, the Germans are mirroring it with their West Wall Siegfried Line, which is, I guess, that's the border of the Rhineland that has to be crosses. And once you cross that, symbolically, the Allies are entering Germany. This is something that doesn't happen in the First World War. No,
and that's a good point. Our sort of focus always on the rise of the Third Reich and the Wehrmacht is, the development of the Luftwaffe, development of the Panzer, German submachine guns, the machine guns, all their equipment, and all that stuff that they'd secretly developed, U-boats, so they've got a submarine fleet, they're trying to build battleships, all that sort of thing. Our focus tends to be on that. But what we do forget, actually, is Germany ended up in an arms race with France, building static fortifications. So as you say, France bizarrely decided that it would anchor its defence on its western border with very, very expensive, high-tech concrete fortifications, because the minute they did that, they lost the initiative because it meant their forces were tied to defending those fortifications. And as we know, of course, when they got to the Belgian border, the Belgians went, we don't want you building it opposite us, so there was a gap in it anyway. But the Germans did the same thing. They then kind of went, well, the French are a threat to us, so we're going to build our own static fortifications, the West Wall, or as we know it, Siegfried Line, east of the Maginot Line. So both sides are pouring concrete and forging steel that there's no tomorrow, and putting guns in pillboxes and laying minefields and barbed wire and all this stuff. So they end up with an armed standoff. But of course, that becomes, by 44, 45, the Siegfried Line, West Wall, becomes very important to the defence of Western Germany.
Well, of course, Monty's just going to go around all this with his dagger thrust into Germany with Market Garden, which fails in that early autumn. Is there another plan? Because the plan is to get over the Rhine, but if you're having to cross the Rhineland, there's quite a lot to cross.
Yeah, I mean, the Rhine's absolutely enormous, but going back to Operation Market Garden, I think it was inspired, and I think Monty's much maligned for that. The problem they had was they did not devote sufficient resources to it, nor did, and this is really the fault of Monty and indeed General Horrocks, they underestimated the Germans' ability to react. By late August and early September, the German armed forces are streaming eastwards towards German, frontier in a state of disarray. So Horrocks and Montgomery just assumed that they just needed to nudge the Germans and they'd be over at Eindhoven and Nijmegen and into Arnhem and do that right hook. Now, even if they'd taken Arnhem, I suspect 30 Corps would have needed to be reinforced quite majorly to get over the river there and then to hook right down into the Ruhr, because that was the plan. So to my mind, it is an inspired plan. It's good because everyone knows that if the Ruhr's surrounded, it's over. And that's what happens, obviously, in April 45. But in September, it's just was not, there was no, again, Horrocks, by his own admissions, says maybe he didn't engender enough urgency in Guards armoured and that they maybe were too leisurely and all this. And it just wasn't quick enough. And the irony is its failure did Hitler and his generals on the Western Front a favour, because Eisenhower kind of then went, well, single thrust doesn't work. I mean, the Germans are absolutely gobsmacked. They're going, well, you've got so much resources. If you pile those into a single fist, that centre of gravity, you'll punch through the Western Front somewhere and you'll be on the road to Berlin, or you'll be south of the Ruhr, and it's all over for us. Whereas Eisenhower kind of went, what we're going to do is we'll grind down the Wehrmacht by fighting an attritional war on the Western Front along its complete length, and that will tie down the German armies and they'll get worn out and then we'll overwhelm them. And you go, yeah, that works. But again, it then takes the initiative off the Western Allies, because you're fighting an attritional war, you're not fighting a manoeuvre warfare. And it also gives the Germans time to recover while they're fighting those defensive battles. And that becomes a crucial mistake, of course, because while the Allies are fighting those defensive battles, or at least the Germans fighting defensive battles, trying to grind them down, Hitler rounds up enough troops to hold the Western Front and gather 2 panzer armies to conduct the Ardennes offensive. So in a way, that shows the flaw in Eisenhower's plan, that the broad front advance actually enabled Hitler to free up some forces, so 5th Panzer Army, which he regenerates, and then create 6th Panzer Army, brand new one, so he can launch the Ardennes offensive. And also what he does is, in terms of defence of the Western Rhine and the Rhine itself, Aachen becomes a key linchpin in the German defence, because it ties down, before the Ardennes offensive takes place, in October, it ties down the American army in this horrible attritional battle. The Germans themselves fight a pretty hopeless defensive battle for the place, but it ties down something like 3 American corps during the course of the battle, and also, of course, distracts Eisenhower, because you've got the Americans going, oh, we're going to capture the very first German city. It's screening the Western Rhine. It streams, Cologne and the other cities on the river.
It's on the Siegfried Line as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it sits. Yeah, Aachen.
There's so much going on for it. You can see why it becomes a focal point.
Yeah, and a complete nightmare for the garrison commander, because the city itself sits between 2 belts of the West Wall. So the population are effectively, depending on how you want to look at it, nicely defended both to the west of the city and the east of it, or they're trapped by these 2 belts of the West Wall. So they're in not a great position, but the Germans fight this sort of delaying defensive battle during October 44. And of course, while the Americans are distracted with that, and Monty's busy licking his wounds in the Netherlands after the Arnhem, and also figuring he's got to clear the Scheldt Estuary, obviously, for Antwerp and capture Walcheren. And while he's doing that, Eisenhower's going, oh, come the Germans are putting up a major battle here, aren't they? Distracting. Well, of course, Hitler's manoeuvring two panzer divisions into place, ready for the Ardennes offensive.
I mean, this is one thing that I hadn't really considered about this fighting in the Rhineland. Generally, you kind of think you'll say get a book and it'll be on, on the Hürtgen, or you'll get a book on, and actually when you take a step back, there is a whole series of things happening all at the same time that when you see them all together, you see, oh, they're all overlapping. You can see where these, because as the fighting at Aachen's going on, we've got the Hürtgen just to the south where the Americans are committing themselves, which becomes a very attritional conflict for the Americans.
Yes, I mean, you're spot on. I agree with you. And I had that exact chain of thought. I thought, military historians, they love D-Day and they love Arnhem and Cassino and Salerno and Operation Husky and all the big battles. And then we sort of lose interest sort of October up to April 45 because the Germans sort of collapse in the ruin. That's the end of the war. And the really interesting bit's the battle for Berlin. So sort of collectively, we lose interest in the tail end of the war. Whereas, of course, the battle for the Rhineland and the end of 44 and early 45 actually they're the key battles for the end of the Second World War on the Western Front. And like you, I'd also had that same experience of you go, the battles are quite well known, but only individually. So, like when you go, oh, well, Battle for the Reich and Operation Veritable, okay. Battle for the Hürtgen, okay. Colmar Pocket down in the south, okay. But very few books actually put them in context because I would argue they're all part of the same thing because they're all part of the overall battle for the Western Front. And actually they all contribute in one way or another to the Germans slowing down the end of the Second World War. Because that's the thing to remember is, of course, that they end up fighting. They can't win, but they end up successfully fighting some pretty good defensive battles, all of which are connected. Because a point I would make about the battle for the Rhineland is really the battle for the forests, because that's where the Germans anchored most of their defence, and much of the West Wall obviously runs through all those forests. So you've got the Reichswald, you've got the Hürtgen, you've got Monschau, you've got the Hochwald. There's this whole chain of huge forests which the Germans dug into, and of course, as we all know, forests are not good for manoeuvre warfare. Tankers don't like them. Even the infantry, to be fair, don't really like them. If you're fighting in a forest, it's an infantryman's battle because you've got to clear every trench, every track, every bunker, and driving through them, of course, is a nightmare because the Germans will mine every single forest track that they come across. So if you push a column up through a wood, it's going to probably hit mines. There's a good chance that the mines will alert the local defenders, and that then turns into an ambush. So particularly the Hürtgen, dreadful. And like you say, I'm not quite sure what the American logic was, because even once they'd taken Aachen, to the south, you're right, is Hürtgen and then Monschau Forest. So the Germans had West Wall going round the city, and it then ran through both those forests as well. So the poor American army, having taken Aachen, then had to fight its way through two forests, and again, further belts of defences for the West Wall. So it just turns into this dreadful attritional warfare. Gone are the days of the stampede from the breakout in Normandy up to the Netherlands. It all just grinds to a halt. But for the Germans, of course, the key thing is what can they do in terms of what's their long goal. And for Hitler, of course, he clung to this ridiculous notion that the Western Allies would fall out, or if they didn't fall out, they would seek to make a separate peace with him, and then he could then redeploy the Wehrmacht onto the Eastern Front and defeat the Red Army and save Germany. So he kept grasping at straws that there would be some sort of miracle. I mean, that's partly why, of course, he launched the Ardennes offensive. He hoped by taking Antwerp, it would deny the Allies a deep water port, slow down their resupply, and maybe cause a rift between the British and Americans. Now, as we know, that didn't happen. Now, we know that there were tensions between the Allied High Command. Why wouldn't there be? You've got lots of diva personalities locking heads a lot of the times, but it never resulted in a crisis within the alliance. But of course, Hitler clung to this. If I can just hold out long enough, and also, of course, with the winter, from September on up into the winter of 40-45, he knows that the Allies will have to slow down anyway. Once the weather turns bad, he gets a breathing space during the winter where he can then prepare his forces in the spring. But the mistake he makes in my mind is he commits those rejuvenated armies to the Ardennes offensive and exhausts them. So he then hasn't got a strategic reserve to protect the Rhine in the west. And likewise, it means he hasn't really got strategic reserves to defend the Vistula and the Oder on the Eastern Front. And of course, as soon as the Ardennes offensive came to a halt, he redeployed 6th Panzer Army to Hungary to launch a counterattack there. There was another watch on the Rhine, but on the Eastern Front, which again fails. So again, he expends the rest of 6th Panzer Army. So he loses all these strategic reserves, which actually, if he'd withdrawn 5th Panzer Army at full strength behind the Rhine as a mobile counter-attacking force, now it would have suffered from Allied air power, but it would have given the Allies pause for thought. There was an entire Panzer Army sitting on the east bank of the Rhine waiting for us to cross. That's not good. And likewise, if he'd done it west of the Vistula or even in front of the Oder, he'd stuck 6th Panzer Army there. That's a good chance it would have slowed down the Red Army, because again, they're going, well, we're facing an entire new re-equipped Panzer Army. But Hitler didn't do that. He kept grasping at straws, because I guess he was probably intoxicated by the success of Blitzkrieg. He kept hoping that they'd have some sort of miracle that would reverse his waning fortunes.
But fighting like at the Hürtgen, where you almost get the feeling the Americans are reinforcing failure, just grinding away. And this is very much, it's the broad front, so everybody's attacking all the time. Is it the same experience for the Germans being ground down, say, at the Hürtgen? Is it as attritional for them? Or actually, are they just sitting back and just letting the Americans bleed?
Well, of course, the initial defensive battles, they take place to the west of the West Wall. So again, Hitler's buying time while things like the Todt organisation rebuild the West Wall, because, of course, we need to remember that the West Wall actually, by the end of 1944, has been stripped. It's not functional anymore, because all the mines and all the weapons that were in it were moved to the Atlantic Wall to fend off Operation Overlord. So a lot of the equipment that was in the West Wall had gone, on top of which locals had obviously pinched phone lines and water had got into the bunkers, the rats had gnawed through the cables, all that sort of thing. Bearing in mind it had been built in the late 30s and we're now in late 44, early 45. It's in a pretty poor state. So Germany had to move quickly. It had to find manpower, so it needed workers, and raw materials to rejuvenate the West Wall. So whilst those initial defensive battles on the Western Front are going on, behind the lines, they're frantically preparing this defensive line for when the British, American, French armies finally reach them. So again, it's this playing for time. Now, it would have been more successful playing for time, obviously, if they'd not done the Ardennes offensive. It didn't really gain them anything, and in fact threw away a lot of, it threw away what they called the miracle in the West, the fact that most of their troops had managed to escape France, and then thanks to Speer, they'd re-equipped them. A lot of their heavy equipment was lost when they got over the Seine, when they retreated out of France. So they replenished all that as well. So, yeah, I think Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. You've got these poor German units pinned down to the west of the West Wall, because all the time, places like Saarbrücken and all the rest of it, all the time that they're delaying them getting to the West Wall, it's more time for them to sow more landmines, get machine guns into them. Because one of the problems they had was that many of the bunkers had been built in the 1930s. And of course, at that point, standard anti-tank gun for the German army was a 37mm, which by 44 is useless against Allied tanks. But the bunkers are too small to get the bigger 75s and the 88s in them. So some of the bunkers have got to be reconfigured, or they have to, do anti-tank gun dugouts. They build bunkers, so they'll build, dirt dugout with logs and earth on the top. So they've got to dig new equipment in because the old bunkers are too small for them. So they're frantically doing this while, like you say, you've got Battle of the Hürtgens going on. Further south, particularly Colmar, again, Colmar is a major distraction for Eisenhower, because after the withdrawal of Army Group G from the south of France, they have fled through the mountains, but Hitler insisted they keep a bridgehead on the west bank of the Rhine there, which is what the Colmar pocket does, because it ties up the French army and elements of the American army while they try and overcome that. And again, Hitler fights a quite clever defensive battle there, because he's able to feed reinforcements in. They're never able to cut off. I think I'm going from memory, but Germans end up with like 8 divisions in the pocket, which is quite considerable. Now they're all Volksgrenadier or infantry divisions, so they're not that heavily equipped. But, he keeps feeding in reinforcements. Of course, the wounded and casualties can be shipped back over the river up until early February down there in Alsace. And also, of course, the Colmar becomes a springboard for Operation North Wind, which followed after the Ardennes offensive, January 45. It's supposed to be timed at the same time. But, there's that brief time when it looks like there's a threat to French liberated Strasbourg. So that pocket is a real nuisance. And again, I think it's a bit like Aachen. Eisenhower gets a bit distracted. Again, the Germans can't understand it. They just go, well, where's the Allied centre of gravity? There doesn't seem to be one. And the answer is, well, after Arnhem, there isn't. And of course, that war of attrition means there's this constant vying amongst Allied generals for supplies. Famously, there's Patton constantly going, I need petrol and I need ammunition now because I'm hightailing it off to somewhere. You've got Bradley and Patch's army groups there. So they're all vying for a finite amount of supplies, which on the whole, as we know, are being trucked across Western Europe. It's not a great arrangement. The operational tempo of the Allied armies really is in part dictated by the speed with which they can get supplies to them, because every time they step up operations, they're burning through fuel and ammo like there's no tomorrow. So, because every time they meet a logjam with the Germans, they expend a lot of stuff, because as we know, particularly the Americans, they like to shovel the hell out of everything before, before trying to take it. On the Allied side, they've got that constant problem.
Looking at Ike's broad front, what's interesting about the Colmar pocket, you look at, obviously that's French, but Hürtgen, they don't seem to have operational names that have come down to us as been familiar. Yet you get to the impresario of battle, the commander of his own battlefield has veritable. Did this mean Monty's 21st Army Group have a pause that allows them to launch a major operation? Or has that come down to us because Monty's told us that's what he did, whether he did it or not? Because he writes his own history, which I always find very problematic when you think about Monty, because so much of it is based on what is, but it'd be like Churchill wrote his own history.
Well, one of the things I found quite interesting when I was researching the book was German generals were quite praiseworthy of both Montgomery and Patton for different reasons. But on the whole, I think they were more impressed with how the American army had developed since, things like Kasserine, since America had entered the war on the Western Front. They were very impressed by how the Americans had fully embraced maneuver warfare or blitzkrieg, and that particularly Patton and some of his colleagues believed in hitting the Germans on the run. So there was not this constant need to get your ducks in a row before you launch your operation. And famously, Patton gets over the Rhine before Monty, because Patton's mantra was press ahead all the time, which kind of is what the Germans did. Blitzkrieg, of course, originally was all about speed. Once you've broken through enemy lines, their troops become demoralized, they become cut off, and they surrender very quickly. And Patton certainly subscribed to that tactic and that strategy, in that he was a great believer on just keep on the move, because once the Germans are overrun, once they're surrounded, they're going to surrender. And he did that. So he gets over the Rhine. Certainly, we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit here, but he gets across the Rhine just before Monty with very little preparation. Whereas Monty spent weeks, after Veritable, he spent weeks preparing for his Operation Plunder and Operation Varsity, the airborne element, for getting across the Rhine. He massed all this bridging equipment, all these assault stuff. He masked the assault area and smoke. So for the Germans knew what was going on, because he's hiding his preparations. They can hear all the noise. It's evidently clear that Monty is going to do a set-piece battle between, Wiesel and Rees. That goes without saying. Their greater problem was what are the Americans going to do and where are they coming over? Again, it's worth remembering that Monty, with Operation Veritable on the Reichswald, fought this attritional battle just to get himself to the river. Reichswald, like the Hürtgen, terrible place to fight. And the Germans had two lines of defences, which Monty, he's basically fighting his way southeast from. So he launches his offensive from the Nijmegen area. So he strikes southeast with the Rhine to the north. But of course, the Germans are dug in the forest. They'd also flooded all the polder land just to the south of the river. So that's not good either. So they fought a really good defensive battle. So to be fair to Monty, 21st Army Group's pretty exhausted by the time it's got to the river. I think, to be fair to him, he's a cautious but sensible general. You're not going to expend your guys' lives unless you know what you're going to do is going to succeed. Because again, he's criticised over Alamein, taking all the credit from Auchinleck because he'd done all the legwork, and Monty was too slow and But he's a good general because he made sure losing is not a possibility. You fight to win. So why rush things? Whereas, of course, down south, US 7th Armoured Division captures Remagen on the 7th of March. Well, you think Monty's operation to get over the Rhine in the north doesn't take place until, March 23rd. I say Patton gets over on the 22nd, anyway, ahead of him. But down south, the German defence then becomes skewed by the whole saga over bridge at Remagen, because Hitler became obsessed that the Allies were over the Rhine there in strength and therefore must be thrown back, which, of course, he didn't have the strength to do. But crucially, Remagen's not a good place to break out because to the north of it, there's a chain of high hills and woods. So for manoeuvre warfare, it's not a good place for the Americans to break out and strike north. But what they did was they established a bridgehead, which of course then proceeds to tie down a lot of German units that could have been used as reinforcements elsewhere. Because as the Allies approach the Rhine, of course, there's then the dilemma of what to do with the Rhine bridges. You know, there are a good dozen major ones along the lower Rhine. Hitler had said they're not to be destroyed because we're going to use them to ferry reinforcements to the West Bank to launch counterattacks. And of course, Hitler's generals, the likes of, Rundstedt and Walter Model and Blaskowitz and all the others, they're going, what reinforcements? And the only reason that we should be keeping the bridges open is to get our guys over to the East Bank as quickly as possible. And then the minute the Allies reach the West Bank, we must blow them up because that will slow them down getting over the river. So there's this whole sort of dichotomy and confusion about what they're supposed to be doing with the bridges and what they're not doing with the bridges. And that's best exemplified, I think, with what happens at Remagen, which turns into this complete farce where you've got a number of officers on site that may or may not be in charge there. There's not really a garrison to speak of. They've got instructions to blow the bridge and they rig it, but the explosives they're given are for demolition in quarries, not to blow up steel, because as we know, when they do finally blow it, it didn't drop into the river. But also, because they're desperate to keep that bridge open for as long as possible, so withdrawing units can get over, because once the bridge is down, they're trapped. And once they're trapped, they're going to have to surrender. So you ended up with this dreadful dilemma. And then again, you end up with Hitler's so furious that the Americans have captured that bridge. He goes on a witch hunt and has a number of German officers executed for dereliction of duty. But it wasn't a deliberate act that the bridge didn't drop. It wasn't a deliberate act that they couldn't hold it because they simply didn't have enough troops. But in the way that sort of Aachen and Colmar becomes a distraction for Eisenhower, Remagen does exactly the same thing for Hitler. He just becomes obsessed that, because he sees the Rhine as this sort of sacred lifeblood of Germany, that he becomes obsessed with trying to drive the Americans back onto the west bank of the river. But in doing so, as I say, he then ends up tying up inordinate amount of resources, which, of course, the Americans are able to hold off. I don't want to say easily, but relatively easy. Ultimately, there's not much chance of them being thrown back into the Rhine.
Well, I wondered if by the time they got to the bank of the Rhine, actually the broad front policy starts to play in the Americans' favour, because suddenly the Germans find themselves very stretched trying to defend an enormous front along the Rhine, not quite knowing where they're going to strike other than Monty's probably going to come across where Monty is and it'll be big.
I say the problems the Germans have is that Hitler insists initially that no one's to be evacuated from the West Bank, so that causes chaos because they've got hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Eastern Front coming into Eastern Germany anyway. They start evacuating Western Germany, they've got nowhere really to put them. So there's this confusion about what to do with the civilian population. So that causes problems. As I said earlier, they're obviously fighting these delaying battles until they get to the West Wall, where the idea is they then hold the Allies west of the river. But, of course, what happens is a lot of those armies, before they even get to the West Wall, are put into a state of disarray. So it's like the Saarplattener, 7th Army down there, and 15th Army, they don't really know, because they've got conflicting orders, they don't really know what the best strategy is for holding the river. And in the meantime, of course, you've got the likes of Patch and Patton overrunning them fairly quickly. Particularly Patton's 3rd Army, they capture a lot of prisoners quite quickly because they keep capturing them on the road. I mean, 7th Army had something like 6 different commanders in the space of 6 months, either because Hitler deemed them not competent or they'd been captured. So again, there's this chain of command confusion. Saarbrücken, even though it's anchored on the West Wall, is lost fairly quickly. So Saarplattenet's overrun pretty quickly. Most of Alsace to the west of the river is overrun pretty quickly. But in doing so, of course, not all those German forces managed to get over the river So they waste all these resources. They basically dissipate much of their military power on the West Bank. Whereas I think for most military commanders, the logic would have been get everyone over the river, leave a screening force, get everyone over the river and drop the bridges as quickly as possible. And then we make the Allies pay for wherever they cross. In fact, what they should have done, of course, was have, or at least if they could have managed it, a screening force on the eastern bank and then some sort of mobile reserve to counterattack where major breakthroughs occur. But of course, they don't do that. And also, of course, the pertinent thing with Remagen is that Hitler's so furious, he sacks Field Marshal von Rundstedt as CNC West, the Commander-in-Chief West, and replaces him with Albert Kesselring, who's a commander in Italy, completely not suitable for the Western Front. Kesselring did a good job in Italy, but the Italian front's much narrower, and Italy's full of mountains. So, of course, when he's sent to even he said, this isn't a job I'm up to doing. It's not what he knows. So Kesselring inherits this, as CNC West, this complete mess, doesn't really know what to do, but of course keeps playing lip service to whatever Hitler wants, because everyone knows it's not a good idea to cross him. And I think the upshot is that, particularly Walter Model, who was a good general, I think he does lose the will to live because he ends up taking his own life. I think he just ends up in this sort of stupor where he just doesn't know what to do. He's a loyal Nazi. He's made this oath to Hitler, oath to Nazi Germany. He's a loyal soldier. He follows orders, but deep down in his heart, he knows that this is going really, really badly. And ultimately, his first duty is to his men. He should be saving as many of his men as he can. He seems to be sort of in this, he's like a rabbit in the headlights almost. He just doesn't seem to be able to make coherent and responsible decisions that are good for his army group.
What's all this do for morale? You change out the commanders, the symbolism of crossing the Rhine into Germany must have been significant to the troops who were witnessing it. Do they hold together?
It's a good question and a good point. Yeah, I mean, at the top level, the German generals know what's going on. So they know they can't win and they know they're going to lose. So that's demoralizing in itself. I think on the ground, on the whole, remarkably, morale of the German army holds, mainly because they're fighting defensive battles and strong points. And also, of course, increasingly, they're fighting for German territory. So they won't give up because they're fighting for their homeland. So on a grassroots level, remarkably, morale doesn't crumble as quickly as you think it might. They carry on following orders and they resist until the last on the whole. Now, large numbers do surrender, particularly once they're surrounded. But the German army doesn't collapse. In fact, even at the end, it doesn't collapse. With the Americans breaking through the south of the Ruhr, and then obviously Monty, when he does Operation Plunder, they're literally to the north and south of the Ruhr. Now, logically, Army Group B should have been withdrawn from the Ruhr, but again, Hitler refuses to let the Army Group withdraw. So it's defending this huge industrial area with no real front lines. And of course, once Allied forces have looped around either side and met up behind the Ruhr region, Army Group B is trapped. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And the pockets closed, I think, on the 1st of April. And then Army Group B lasts 2 weeks trapped.
That's 300,000 troops. That's enormous. That's like Stalingrad sort of numbers.
It kind of reminded me of actually the French defeat at Dien-Bien-Phu because they don't surrender as such. The defence just sort of fades away. Locally, you get officers who surrender their units and their men, but there's no overarching order because Model has just gone into this sort of stasis, this trance almost. The sensible thing would have been, right, the war's over. I'm not answering to Hitler because something's going to happen to him anyway. I will order the surrender of Army Group B, but he doesn't do that. All his commanders have to do it at different levels, to the extent you end up with sort of some fairly minor officers who have to take responsibility for large numbers of troops, because the more senior officers have either fled or just don't want to make the decision because they're worried that if it gets back to Hitler that they've surrendered. Now, bearing in mind, early April, Hitler's got much more pressing things to be worrying about than what's going on in the Ruhr pocket, because obviously the Red Army's rapidly approaching the Oder and then gets over it mid-April. So the war is much closer to Berlin on the Eastern Front than it is on the Western.
What's happened to German civilians? Because they are now under direct. They're not just being bombed. You've got Allied troops marching through. Do they become a problem? Where does their support lie? They often get overlooked, other than people and refugees on the move. And I'm not even sure how many of them go on the move, because where they're going to go on the move to.
Hitler sort of vacillated on evacuating people, and people like Albert Speer kept saying we need to move the civilian population, because if we leave them there, they're in the battle zone. So, as the fighting comes together, they need to be moved out of the way. And Hitler wouldn't do it. But I think one of the reasons was he didn't want, there aren't many trains by that stage, but he didn't want the railway lines or indeed the roads clogged up by fleeing civilians. The military needed those, so telling them to stay at home was a safer thing. The other thing, of course, is that lots of civilians were in the Volkssturm, so the German Home Guard. So the idea was that they would fight tenaciously for their towns and villages and hamlets, that they would slow down the Allies by tough resistance. But they're ill-equipped, they're all trained, they're either young or really old, so they're not actually much good. And the other thing, of course, is that Speer is trying to do, until he basically gets cut off by Hitler, is Hitler's given this sort of, the scorched earth order, in that German industry is to be denied the Allies. So it's all to be blown up and set fire and destroyed. When, of course, Speer looking ahead is going, well, Germany's defeated, but at some stage it's going to need to be rebuilt and resurrected. So we need our industry. So blowing up everything doesn't help the future of Germany. Now, of course, Hitler's not thinking like that. He's thinking, well, Germany's failed me. It deserves everything it gets. The Volk, the German people have let me down, and this is their punishment. Whereas Speer and a number of other generals are going, this just doesn't make sense. Why? The Allies have already bombed a lot of it to the ground anyway. The stuff that's still functioning, why would we blow this up? So Speer does his utmost to try and circumvent the orders to blow things up. I think with varying success, but in the closing stages of the war, he's basically fallen out with Hitler because, he let Hitler know in uncertain terms where he felt Germany stood. So Hitler cuts him out from his inner circle. So Speer ends up on his own. The other thing is that the thing that's interesting with Speer is that I don't think he liked being in Berlin. So he was on the road a lot. He was always off out inspecting units or visiting factories or the front line. He was always liaising. And I think that's probably because he didn't really want to be in the madhouse that was Berlin. But of course, what it meant was that senior Nazis were regularly plotting against him because he wasn't there. So he kind of left himself exposed to the machinations of Hitler's inner court. The likes of Goebbels and Goering and all the rest of them that coveted his authority and his kingdom, if you like. But again, well, by early 1945, Speer hasn't really got a kingdom, because it's all fallen down around everyone's ears. But there's still all this, ridiculous rivalry amongst senior Nazis to the extent they won't cooperate with each other. And you think, well, your country's facing defeat. Why are you doing this? It should be all hands to deck, but they don't do that. And of course, in the closing months of the war, it increasingly becomes every man for himself. They either flee or the more loyal ones stay with Hitler and in the bunker at the very end.
Anthony, we're going to pause there, folks. We'll be back after this short break. Rhineland's kind of it for the end of the war for the Allies, isn't it? They sort of get to the... I guess the Elbland would be... Still fighting on the Rhineland, or Monty sort of pushes sort of further round at the top, but that is sort of the end of the fighting, is it, the Rhineland? It's where it sort of peters out.
The agreement was that Berlin was firmly within the Soviet occupation zone, so was to be taken by the Red Army. The Americans did have a chance of getting to the city before, so while the Red Army's held up on the Seelau Heights and on the Oder, the Americans could have got over the Elbe when they reached the river and made a thrust for Berlin. But the Americans calculated it would cost them something like 100,000 casualties to take a city that they then would have to evacuate because it had been agreed that the Red Army would occupy it anyway. So there was no benefit for the Western Allies unless they were going to stay. Now, obviously, Britain, France and America had occupation zones within the city, but I think rather cynically it was felt nothing was to be gained by cutting its way to the city. So you're right. So the key factor, certainly for Montgomery, once Arnhem's been liberated, so in early April, Arnhem's, what's left of it, is finally liberated. And Monty's 21st Army Group hooks left into northern Germany because they want to secure Bremen and Hanover. And there was some concerns that the Red Army was going to launch some sort of airborne operation into Denmark, which of course would give them the control of the states into the Baltic. So they wanted to head off any Soviet moves along the Baltic coast further than they'd already got, because obviously they'd taken Königsberg and Gdansk and all those places along the south coast of the Baltic Sea as they'd advance. Because that's one of the reasons, of course, they delayed taking Berlin, is they wanted to clear Prussia and everywhere else to the north so there wasn't a threat of a counterattack on their right flank as they took Berlin. So Monty peels off northwards, and the Americans get to the Elbe and decide that they're not going to. There's no point politically. They shouldn't do it anyway, and militarily there's no point. The only thing they do have is they then have the sort of odd situation of they're then sort of saving two German armies that have fled from the south of Berlin. They're trying to get over the river to surrender to them. They don't want to surrender to the Red Army. Yeah, it's 12th and 9th Army that Hitler had instructed to march to the relief of Berlin and sever the Red Army spearhead, and save Berlin at the last moment. Their commanders obviously had gone, well, that's not going to happen. Actually, our first duty is to our men. So 12th Army, which had been created actually to hold the Americans at bay, marches eastwards as instructed by Hitler, but actually only reaches 9th Army, and then those people they can save, they then march westward back. And then the Americans have the sort of awkward situation of, well, do they let them over the river? Don't they let them over the river? They can come over the river, but not with weapons. So there's this state of confusion. In the north, again, the Allies have that problem of, like you said earlier, they're confronted by over 300,000 German prisoners. Well, that takes, not to mention what they've already taken along other sections of the Rhine. They've got this huge number of, they've probably got 500,000 POWs at least on the Western Front. They've got to process them. They've got to round them up, because there are apocryphal stories of what happens to the Germans once they've surrendered in the Ruhr pocket, because for a time they can't get water to them. There's no rations, so there's no tents, so they're set outside in the rain. There's one instance where a farmer brought them dirty water in an oil drum, and they then end up sick. So there's this awful sort of humanitarian crisis looming in the Ruhr pocket, and not forgetting, of course, that's 300,000 people in uniform. That's not forgetting the Ruhr population that's still there. And then close to the cities up and down the Rhine, Cologne and Bonn and Dusseldorf and all the others, large proportions of the civilian populations have stayed put, so they're still there as well. So the Allies have got to try and figure out, how to feed them, how to look after them. Because in some places, I think it's Cologne, the Americans were amazed to be welcomed as liberators, by some of the civilians, because they were so sick of the war and sick of Hitler and the Nazi Party that they viewed that they were being liberated, not occupied.
It's funny you should mention the Monty pushing. My father ended the war on the Denmark sort of border with 30 Corps, and and his best mate went and married a German girl. And my mum always said, I wonder what it was like for her to come back to Britain in 90. He was demobbed before my father, so he'd be demobbed in like 46 or something. Wonder what it was like for her to come back to Britain as a German.
Yeah, who earlier would have been deemed an enemy alien. It's worth remembering that there's an army group trapped in the Netherlands. So we end up with a humanitarian aid crisis in the Netherlands as well, because they have that dreadful winter where the occupying Germans have taken all the food, they've blown up all the dikes, they've blown up a lot of the railroads. They sort of punished the Dutch people by starving them pretty much during the winter. So come the early spring of 45, there's this humanitarian civilian crisis in the Netherlands in the occupied areas, because the Allies are struggling to get food to them. But also there's an entire army group, I can't remember numbers, it's about 120,000 troops, I think, still in the Netherlands. And obviously they've resisted the Canadians and the British pushing north up through the Netherlands as much as they can. But you've got this huge pocket of German troops who end up trapped in the northern Netherlands against the sea, and the Allied armies advancing. Again, you've got that slows down the Allies, because, north of Arnhem, you've got this enormous body of German troops that have got to be rounded up. Their weapons have got to be collected. So it's a real logistic headache, which again, of course, is preoccupying the Allies once they're over the Rhine as to where are they going in terms of occupying Germany. Obviously, Western Germany, they've got their zone. In the case of Berlin, of course, the Allies didn't enter Berlin until July. So they left it a long time before they actually occupied their allotted occupation zones in the city, by which time, of course, the Soviets and Red Army had stripped everything bare. When 7th Armoured Division turned up, when the Red Army vacated a barracks that they'd been in for 7th Armoured, it was in a terrible state. It was just awful. It was just an absolute mess. They didn't care. Yeah, going back to the Rhineland, I think, those battles are really important, despite the fact we sort of see them as a footnote or the bookend to the campaign in front. And also from my perspective, because I'm an old Cold War warrior, our fixation with the Rhine helped sow the seeds of the Cold War, because there was not the desire there to get to Berlin. Now, things may have gone more differently had we got there, because, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Soviets had the forerunner Berlin on their own for quite a while, and then didn't like the idea that the Allies arrived anyway. And, of course, they didn't like those Western outposts in the middle of East Germany, so that clouded things. So, in hindsight, you do think, in terms of post-war Europe, that the Allies should not have been so fixated with the Rhine as the end point, or to be fair, the Elbe. But I mean, the Elbe to a lesser extent, because the German armies are spent after the Rhine. There's nothing, there's no viable resistance. It's piecemeal, anything that they come across. It's just bandit country.
Yeah, its symbolism is the Rhine as well. It's a big border crossing. There's so much. You're in Germany,
and it is the physical barrier for West. That was the one thing that would hold the Allies at bay, was the sheer length and the.
Isn't that the edge of the Roman Empire? Is that where the Limes was? Was that as well? I mean, it is.
Yeah, I think it's as far as the Romans got, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's that kind of. It is the.
Yeah, because the Teutoburg Forest is to the east, isn't it? The Romans gave up trying to conquer east of the Rhine, didn't they? Just
maybe they went from our period. But it does show how these physical barriers become symbolic for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Well, I think that's partly why Hitler was obsessed with it. That's the point I make in the beginning of the book, is that he first saw the Rhine in 1914 during the First World War and loved the region so much that he claimed he went there once a year, I don't know, on state visits or on holiday. So even for him, it had that mythic symbolism for, Germany. It's one of, along with the Oder, it's the other major river that covers German territory. So for him, it had this mythic symbolism in his mind. Again, going back to my original point, for him, that's where he first tested Western resolve on whether or not his plans to build a German empire will be resisted or not. And Britain and France clearly failed that test. So for him, it was doubly symbolic once his armies had marched over the river in 1936. So I say for me, it kind of comes full circle, because it's in the Rhineland and then in the Ruhr that his armies on the Western Front are finally destroyed. And it's one of those big ifs. What should he have done? As I said when we began, logic was he should have withdrawn his armies east of the river and fought from there. But instead, he allowed his armies to be destroyed piecemeal on the western banks.
Well, that seems like a natural place to end. It's always a pleasure to chat, Anthony. Thank you very much. Loyal listener, Rhineland is available online and in all good bookshops. It's a detailed, accessible account of this crucial but often overlooked campaign on the Western Front, and I will, of course, put a link in the show notes. Now, if you enjoy the show, just a quick reminder, it's only me here behind the microphone. I do all the research, recording and editing myself. Listener support really does make a difference. Becoming a patron helps keep the podcast going. You get ad-free listening along with bonus excerpts from interviews that didn't make it into the main episode. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that's all for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.